Hey guys, welcome back to Swipe Up for Justice. Here at UCLA, it's me, Nick, a fourth year sociology major. And today we're going to be talking about some pretty interesting things regarding race within the university and the role of the university and all that it entails. So before we get started, I think it's important for all of us to just kind of go around and give a brief intro, just so we're all aware and have a general sense of our backgrounds and our point of views and where we're coming from.
Hi everyone, I'm Lily Saeed. I am a transfer student, third year. This is my first quarter at UCLA. My major is sociology, and my background is I am half Montenegrin and half Persian. Both of my parents are immigrants, and that is a viewpoint I'm going to be bringing in today.
Okay. Hi everyone. My name is Jenny Odias. I'm a second year sociology major. And my background is that both of my parents immigrated from Mexico, and I have also taken a few Chicano courses.
Hi, I'm Dan Kamen. I'm a senior sociology student. I'm also a transfer from Santa Monica College, and both my parents are first-generation immigrants to the United States from Iran. So I'm a Iranian Jewish American. So today we're going to be talking about the 1993 protests at UCLA. This was regarding the Chicano Studies program at UCLA, because originally Chicano Studies wasn't actually its own department. It was instead an undergrad major and a doctoral specialization before 1993. But then during 1993, there was budget cuts at UCLA. And one of the first things UCLA was like, we should take this away. We don't need it, was the Chicano Studies department. And this actually made lots of students angry, frustrated. Lots of community members were upset about this. So this then led to protests at UCLA. Much of it was very peaceful. There's many protesters. But there was actually one incident that wasn't as peaceful. There were some windows broken at the UCLA Faculty Center. Around 80 individuals were arrested after about $30,000 worth of damage was done. And clearly people were upset.
Right. Just to touch on what you've already mentioned is, in the beginning when you talked about the Chicano studies being cut, I think it's important for us to question why the university came for the Chicano studies department first. What does this say about a university who goes for a department that represents communities of people? And why is that the one being cut? We need to question the university and ask why is this the budget cut that they need to make,
I definitely agree. I feel like it shows the university and the value that, the university's opinion on, the value of the Chicano Studies department. And it also shows, the opinion that the university would have on, the people who would argue against the Chicano Studies department getting cut.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to focus with you guys today was that although many protests have a general goal, this one was to get Chicano Studies back up and running. They didn't want it cut. But within the protest, there was differing views. One view, noted by Michael Sototenko, sorry if I butchered that, was that there was a small group that did a hunger strike at UCLA. And this group, unfortunately, he viewed them as patriarchal, homophobic, and a route to traditional Chicano political agenda. This is a problem because lots of previous Chicano studies at UCLA was sexist. Unfortunately, it focused on machismo, and it had a narrow nationalistic point of view. Actually, one professor, Professor Ortiz, noted that because she was Puerto Rican, students actually dismissed her views simply because she was Puerto Rican and not because she was Mexican. They were like, oh, you have no idea what it's like. You're not Mexican. So unfortunately, Chicano studies had a certain type of view beforehand. After 1993, during these protests, many people wanted to actually incorporate feminism into Chicano studies. They wanted other viewpoints. They didn't want patriarchy. They didn't want homophobia. They didn't want all this traditional stuff. They wanted a new focus. But when there was a small hunger protest, unfortunately, this group, although very, very small compared to the entire protest group, was able to dominate the negotiating table. So when UCLA, after being like told by the protesters, like, no, we need Chicano studies, they were like, okay, fine. They came to the negotiating table. But when they met with the hunger protesters and the allies of the hunger protesters, the new Chicano studies at UCLA unfortunately was then again based on a return to old-fashioned Chicano academics. I don't know if you guys have anything to add to that.
Right. I mean, I think it speaks to the focus, and honestly it speaks to the responsibility of the university, you know, as an institution. Like, they have power to influence, they have power to change just as equally. So when you have a university that is, you know, accepting this narrative of machismo and this single point of view of what a Chicano studies department is supposed to look like, I mean, I think it goes to show, like, those students who discredited the Puerto Rican, I believe you said, or Guatemalan, right? Or
It was a Puerto Rican professor.
Yeah, Puerto Rican professor, Professor Ortiz. It goes to show that maybe that what they learned in that narrow spaced Chicanos department is what could have influenced them to disregard what that professor was saying. Like, so, you know, it's important for us to think about the responsibility of this institution, of this entity, and its influence on its students and on its people in general. Like, they're passing off this knowledge, you know? So, like, you know, we have to hold them responsible.
Yeah, that's an important point to bring up, just because now the Chicano department is titled Department of Chicano and Chicanas and Central American Studies, and one of the reasons why it was changed to this was because there was Central American students at UCLA that felt that what they were learning in the Chicano courses only applied to Mexicans, so they wanted representation in these courses because they were going through a lot of similar things that Chicanos were going to, but it wasn't relating to Central America. So it was really important that the Chicano department became more inclusive, especially with faculty as well.
Yeah, I thought it was just in general really interesting how there could be so many differing views within a single protest. So while this single protest might want, again, in this case, the Chicano studies back, there's differing views within it. That's very similar to the current Black Lives Matter protest. So, of course, they're trying to get Black lives to matter. They want people to recognize that they do matter. But within the protest, there's many differing views. One of these is regarding defunding the police. So depending on who you ask, defunding the police has very, very different meanings. Some want the money from police completely taken away. Others, they want it to go to certain groups instead, maybe social workers or other things that can help, like certain people that can go on to nonviolent calls instead of police. So depending on who you ask, there's a different idea of defunding the police. In fact, there's some statistics. Americans in general, on average, 58% of Americans oppose defunding the police, while 31% support it. However, when you change the question to not straight up defunding, but instead moving that money into police budgets regarding better police training, into moving that money into local programs for homelessness, mental health assistance, domestic violence assistance, that number rose all the way up to 76%. So 76% of Americans agree with it, while only 22% opposed. So this is a big change, and it all regards on how they define defund the police. Because again, with the protesters, some hate the police. Some actually, according to this article, this one protester says the pigs don't serve us; they only protect the rich property. So they don't trust the police at all. And this led to some protesters being violent, some throwing rocks at police, some doing other violence. But in general, the vast majority of protesters were very peaceful. One protester at the same protest said that these individuals aren't helping when they're being violent to the police. Instead, it is more helpful if we stay peaceful. So within the protest, there's differing views.
Right. I mean, I think you bring up an important theme regarding protests or social movements in general, and that's definition. And I think, to me at least, the way people define situations or experiences, or in this case, social movements like the Black Lives Matter, um, and what that entails is that relationship to these movements, to these experiences, really influences and guides your definition. So we have these varying definitions of what it means to defund the police, because we have varying people who have different relationships with the police. You know, we have communities of people who have been oppressed and have been mistreated by, and you know, it's something that is gross and alive in America, and it's something that I think that those who don't have as close of a relationship to this experience need to listen to those that do, the communities that do. And I think it's just really, I mean, you don't go to a doctor, right, to tell you about your studying habits, right? You go to a doctor to tell you about your health. So I think one of the many things that can tie back into the Chicano Studies movement is the power of the institution, and going to those institutions and asking them to listen to them, to listen to that community, just like the Black Lives Matter community is going to institutions and telling them to listen to them, you know? So it brings a very important question on the role of these institutions, whether it's the media or the university in the Chicano Studies movement, you know?
And tying it back to the role of these institutions, recently for the Black Lives Matter movement, UCLA housed prisoners from UCPD in the Jackie Robinson Stadium. And it just shows how they, you know, were for these movements, because they, you know, volunteered to house prisoners on campus.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think,
Oh, you
sorry.
go ahead.
I think another thing to mention is how important like media is when looking at these protests. And I think an important note that you made, Dan, was just how many different subgroups there are within a protest. Whereas in the Chicano protest, there was the people who were on a hunger strike whose voices came off louder than anyone else's, even though they're promoting patriarchal views and homophobic views and very traditional Chicano agenda, which was a step away from what all those people out there were protesting for, yet they were the ones who ended up at the negotiating table. Same thing with the Black Lives Matter movement, where there were plenty of peaceful protests happening everywhere. Personally, from like Orange County, I was seeing, you know, flyers like just about every day in Huntington Beach and all over, where people were just standing there and chanting, and, you know, no looting or anything like that was occurring. And versus on the media, all it seemed to show was as if an entire rebellion had taken forth, and everyone protesting was just, you know, disrespecting the entire institution. And I feel like they did that in a sense to kind of back up their stance on why there's so many police and why they were so, you know, brutal with using tear gas and rubber bullets, and the media kind of just supporting and perpetuating this notion of like these protesters being violent and kind of just taking the movement and running with it. And especially from like you know, like a mass society view, it was definitely seen as like more of a violent movement because of this.
Yeah, I want to take it back to your point that the small hunger protest group was able to kind of take over the protest in general, because leadership has become very different in modern movements. Because Black Lives Matters is a very interesting case because it's a decentralized movement. So there is no leader for Black Lives Matter. So all these different areas, all these different places have their own big, smaller Black Lives Matters movements. So people protest how they want to protest. They get their voice heard how they want to get it heard. So they don't focus on a leader, and that leader isn't able to come and be like, hey, we only want this, and let's disregard what all these other protesters want. So all the protesters basically can get their voice heard with about the same varying amount of it being heard. There's no voice being heard more than other voices. Unfortunately, while that does make Black Lives Matter more flexible, if one small group, again, like for the Chicano studies, is able to get heard slightly more, this case, it's kind of media that's causing this, because the media is only showing violent protests, because that's what gets clicks, that's what gets money. So when they show these violent protesters, it then everyone considers Black Lives Matter, like, while the vast majority of these protesters are completely nonviolent, they're peaceful, and they're fighting for a cause they care about, other people are then attributing violence to them. And that's unfortunately what's happening now with movements.
I completely agree. And, public perception really is everything, and the media has such a say. But even in regards to talking to the people around me who were, sitting watching the news like 8 hours a day and, debating back and forth with me about these protesters looting and destroying stores and whatnot, I think that it's important to note that these protests happened because human lives were not being valued at all, and the justice system was failing them entirely. And if a human life is not valuable enough to get justice, why do whatever shoes are being stolen matter? Why does a glass door matter? If you can't uphold the most basic principle of just not killing one another regardless of what authority figure you're in, how can we respect any other law?
Exactly. I think just to piggyback off of the conversation, a general theme is framing, and the power of framing, and the power of these entities, of these institutions, of the media, and their persuasiveness. And these institutions like the media and education play such a critical role in society and in people's lives. They directly affect the decisions, the choices, the outcomes of people. And so when the media can frame a movement in a way that benefits them, they will. Just like an institution can frame a movement that benefits them, they will. So again, it calls on to the questioning of the power that these institutions hold, and what are they using it for? We have to question, what are they perpetuating? What are they hiding? What are they promoting? And it's just really important for us to constantly be thinking and questioning. We're in an era of questioning. This whole generation, I think, is, in questioning. We went from believing in just empirical, traditional stuff and then empirical fact, and now it's questioning in this postmodern era. It's just an era of questioning, and I think that's really important. And I think that's what has sparked a lot of these movements and a lot of change. I don't know if anyone has any other thoughts on the power of these institutions and their roles.
I mean, I think a lot of great points were brought up, and this is a lot of great food for thought. The year of 2020 has definitely taught us to stand up for what we believe in. I mean, these protests were definitely something that I feel shook the country, and it brought a lot of attention to this movement. And, no one can say that they don't know what this is anymore. And I think that it's important, going forward, to continue to have these conversations and continue to sign petitions and go to protests and contact your local, city council or congresswoman, or, just put your opinions out there and, show that we're not going to be silent. That being said, that is all the time we have left.
Thanks for coming to Swipe Up for Justice, and we'll see you next week, guys. It was a great conversation. Keep having these conversations.
See you guys next week.
See you.